Good morning. Good to see everybody here this morning. Tim, I actually think I got the mic cut on this time. The last two times I've been here, I haven't been up here, I haven't cut the mic on, but I think we're actually good this time today. I want to talk today about mistakes made by successful people. And I've got successful in quotation marks because the people we're going to talk about, that we're going to mention, were only successful from the world's viewpoint. So we got to make sure we understand what kind of success we're talking about. There's sort of a urban legend I want to tell you about, and it's about a meeting that supposedly took place. There's really no evidence that this actually happened, but in 1923, supposedly, the legend goes that there was a meeting that was held at Edgewater Beach Hotel in Chicago. That is a real place. At this meeting, in attendance were 9 of the wealthiest people in the world at that time. Their combined wealth is estimated exceeded the wealth of the government of the United States at that time. So that's pretty impressive. And it was said to have been both a celebration of their success as well as an opportunity to plan their future exploits and dominance. Attending the meeting were the following men: the president of the largest steel company, the president of the largest utility company at the time, the president of the largest gas company, the president of the New York Stock Exchange, the president of the Bank of International Settlements, the greatest wheat speculator, the greatest bear on Wall Street, the head of the world's greatest monopoly, and a member of President Harding's cabinet at the time. So these are well-to-do people, pretty influential people, obviously very wealthy people, people that the world would say are very successful people. So that's kind of an urban legend. Don't really know if that's true or not. But these facts are true. 25 years later, Charles Schwab, who was the president of the steel company, Bethlehem Steel Company, he lived on borrowed capital for about 5 years before he ended up dying bankrupt. Actually, if he would have held on, the Great Depression came through. If he would have held on, they said he probably made his money back, but he ended up dying bankrupt. The president of then the largest gas company, Howard Hobson, went insane. One of the greatest commodity traders, the wheat speculator, Arthur Cutton, died awaiting prosecution for tax evasion. Richard Whitney, he was the president of the New York Stock Exchange. He was in prison. He was actually just about to get out of prison for crooked dealings in the stock exchange. Albert Fall, he was the member of President Harding's cabinet. He was pardoned from jail to be able to go home and die in peace. So he had his own issues, and they sent him home to be able to die. He actually, I read, he actually ended up living about 12 more years. But again, he had a tough go of it too 25 years later. The rest of these men, Jesse Livermore, he was the greatest bear on Wall Street. He committed suicide. Ivar Kruger, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, he was president of the then greatest monopoly. He committed suicide. Leon Fraser, he was president of the Bank of International Settlement. He also had committed suicide. Sam Insull, he was the president of the largest utility company, spent time as a fugitive from justice and died with 12 cents in his pocket. So each and every one of these men had placed power and riches as the most important thing in their life, and it led to ruin. Now, I want to stop and say that not every person that pursues riches and is able to get and maintain those riches, bad things like this happen to them. I mean, we're not saying that. There are plenty of people who get rich and they're able to stay rich. We're not saying that's impossible. What we are saying, though, is that these men placed great confidence in their riches and they missed the mark. And we see the ruin that happened in their lives. They were considered successful by the world's standards, but they failed according to God. And so I want to build off of that and make a lesson off that and consider several biblical characters that were successful but made mistakes. That's what we want to talk about this morning. And so we'll jump right in. We've got several to talk about. In the first place, we want to talk about King Solomon. King Solomon. Solomon was asked by God what he would like to be given. If you remember that story, God approached Solomon. I mean, it's just amazing to even think about. We just covered this in one of the classes that we talked about. And God asked Solomon, what would you like to have? And he could have asked for anything. He could have asked for riches or anything else the world had to offer. But he chose wisdom. And then God gave that to him, but then, of course, he made him rich and he gave him all the other things as well. It's pretty interesting how God worked with Solomon in that way. But you know the story of Solomon in 1 Kings 11, beginning at verse 1. It says, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, 'You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods.' Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart." God said, don't marry those people that have the potential to turn you away. He knew that. Solomon ignored that, and he loved them. It says he clung to them in love, and his wives turned away his heart. It's kind of interesting because Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived, and you think surely Solomon could see that and recognize the danger in that. But we learn, I think, from Solomon, it doesn't matter how wise we are, it doesn't matter how strong we are, evil influences can and will turn us away from God. Solomon was a successful person. I mean, the richest man that has probably ever lived. I mean, if we were talking in class this morning, if we could try to put Solomon's riches into today's numbers, I think Garrett came up with a number like 2.3 trillion. Who knows? But just more money than you can hardly even imagine would be the kind of wealth that Solomon would have. The world would say he was a great success story. But to God, this is a failure if your heart is turned away, and he allowed these wives to turn his heart away from God. So we can allow influences to turn us away from God, and we can lose our soul because of that. What about Samson? Samson was a man of valor. He was a war hero. Obviously a very strong man. He had been given that strength from God. Samson was just a guy that you wouldn't want to mess with. And he had been very blessed, again, as a war hero. But you know the story of Samson in Judges 16, beginning at verse 4. Samson loved this woman named Delilah. It says, "After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, 'Seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver.' So Delilah said to Samson, 'Please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound, that one could subdue you.'" So the key here is he loved this woman, Delilah. She was offered 1,100 pieces of silver from each of them to go and get him to tell her where his great strength lies, and that's exactly what she did. It's really interesting. She, almost word for word, "Tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound, that one could subdue you." You know, she didn't even kind of sugarcoat it. "Just tell me why you're so strong." She said exactly what they wanted her to find out. You know how the story goes. We won't read all the verses. Sort of after teasing around about it for a little while, Samson eventually told her, and then, of course, he lost his great strength. So the two stories that we've mentioned so far with Solomon and Samson, we've talked about two stories where these men loved women who were not worthy of affection, but I don't want the ladies to think I'm picking on them. There's a lot of stories where men likewise are not worthy of affection or attention, but they're given illegitimate affection, and it causes great ruin. But Solomon and Samson are two examples of that. There's others, though, in the Bible. These men would be considered successful people, but they made mistakes. There's other examples. What about the rich young ruler? You know the story of the rich young ruler. It's found in Matthew chapter 19. In verse 20, it says, "The young man said to him," talking to Jesus, "All these I have kept." All the commandments he's kept from his youth. "What do I still lack?" Jesus said to him, "If you would be perfect, go and sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." When the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. There's the problem. So now what Jesus was saying here is not that us today and everybody needs to sell everything that they have and give it all away, give it all to the poor. The problem here with this fellow was that was his hang-up. That was his issue. He had great possessions, and that's what's mentioned here. And he loved those things. Those were number one in his life. He loved material wealth more than he loved God. I think it is interesting, though, that he was religious. I mean, he told Jesus up here, we didn't have the previous verses, but he said, "All these I've kept." talking about the commandments of God. He has kept all the commandments from his youth. He loved Jesus, I think. He loved the idea of serving God, but riches had the uppermost place in his heart. Riches were number one to him. And so the question we got to ask ourselves is, what's uppermost place in your heart? What's your first priority? What is of most value to you personally? Because if there's anything in your heart that's above God, you better get rid of it. Because what you're doing is forfeiting your soul, and that's exactly what happened to this fellow. He had many great possessions. He was a rich man. I mean, his name that we call him by is the rich young ruler. He was a success story, but a failure to God, because he wasn't willing to do what it took in order to be right with God. And in his case, that was getting rid of all of his possessions. You know, Jesus said, we don't have the verse on the slide, but Jesus said, what is a man profited if he gained the whole world but lose his soul? And that's so true. Most valuable thing you have is your soul, and this fellow didn't recognize that. In the reading that was done earlier, 1 Timothy 6, beginning at verse 9, it says, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Many of the successful men that we talked about earlier, all of them, would fall upon the teaching of this passage because they loved money, and they were meeting to talk about how they could get more of it and keep the money that they had. The love of money is the root or the base of all kinds of evil. And you know as well as I do, you know people who have become so caught up in the pursuit of wealth that they pierce themselves through with many sorrows. I'm sure you know people like that, just like I do. And so being a worldly success isn't all it's cracked up to be sometimes. And you will pierce yourselves through with many sorrows if you're not careful. And that's exactly what happened with the rich young ruler. There's more that we could talk about, though. What about the rich man from Luke 12? Remember the rich man in Luke 12? So the Lord called this fellow a fool. It said, he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Like that phrase. So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So the Lord called him a fool because he said, when I take you tonight, who's going to be the owner of all your things? All the things that you've worked hard for, who will they belong to now? The saying is true. You've heard it, and I've heard it said so many times. You can't take it with you when you go. I heard a preacher one time say he's never saw a U-Haul following a hearse. And that's true. You can't take it with you when you go. But the application for him as well, for us, all the things that we work for and all the things that we think make us successful, one day they're going to belong to somebody else. And that's what the Lord said to him. Whose is it going to be after you're gone? Well, it's not going to be yours. You're not going to hold on to it forever. So the things that make you successful aren't the stuff that you have, right? Jesus said the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God is going to be like that fellow. So we need to lay up treasure and be rich toward God is the application. In Matthew chapter 6, beginning of verse 19, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust doth destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So don't lay up treasures on earth, is what Jesus said. Lay up treasures in heaven. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. What does that mean? Well, the key is down here at the bottom. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So where's your time spent? Where's your attention found? What's important to you? You know, those things show. Those things that I treasure in my heart will show. If my time and attention is always only spent on successful wealth of the world type things, well, that'll show. You'll be able to see that. But if my time is spent laying up treasures for heaven, that should show as well. That's where my heart will be. That's where I'll be showing where my treasure's at. And so we show by our actions and our pursuits where our heart is. Whatever your interests are, that's where your heart is. It's amazing to me to think about people that are Christians who say their heart is with God, but they don't make an effort to be at services. I mean, can you really say that your heart is with God if you don't make an effort to show up to the worship services? Or they don't ever talk to people about God. People are dying, literally, spiritually dying to hear the message of God. And if our heart is right, if that's where our treasure's at, then it's going to show, and we're going to be making effort in those regards. So the rich man in Luke 12 was successful, but he wasn't rich toward God. What about another rich man? This is the rich man with Lazarus, trying to make sense of all these, because all these people are successful monetarily, the last three that we've talked about especially. Solomon was probably the richest man that ever lived. But this rich man with Lazarus, you remember that story, found in Luke 16. Rich man, Lazarus, they both died. It says, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off, and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. So they both died. The poor man died. See if it'll write there. The rich man also died. So we know the end of the situation. Whether you're poor or rich, death isn't a respecter of persons. We're all going to die unless the Lord returns. So that's no big surprise there. Both of them died. But the rich man, he fared sumptuously every day. He ate good. He was well taken care of. He had things that were great in life for him. He would be a success story for sure. But he neglected his soul. And he found himself in torment. And then he looked across the way there, and he saw Lazarus. He saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. So Lazarus, who was just a poor, pitiful beggar, he just wanted to eat crumbs off the king's table in life. We would say Lazarus was an unsuccessful person materially. He obviously was poor, just trying to scrape up a little bit of food to survive. But then when you get on the other side of this life, the rich man's in torment, and Lazarus is comforted. And so he called out for help, and he said, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I'm in anguish in this flame. The end of this story is the end for all of those who don't recognize the importance and value that should be placed on spiritual things. This rich man found out too late. But we've got the opportunity today to understand and appreciate success in this life doesn't necessarily mean success in the next. And notice he was in anguish in the flame, if it'll let me write. You may get what you want out of life, like those men we talked about in the beginning. But if you're not rich toward God, if you're not laying up treasures toward God, if you're neglecting your soul, you're going to wind up in torment like this fella. In Hebrews 2, beginning of verse 2, the Hebrew writer says, for since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? The question is, we're not going to escape. We're not going to escape. We're going to receive what we're due if we neglect the great salvation that's offered to us. That's what happened with that rich man. And among these other people, they neglected the opportunity for salvation. All right, there's several others we can talk about. There's a lot of successful people in the Bible, but we'll mention just one more, and that's Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot. We know about Judas. One of the primary issues for him was covetousness. He was the treasurer. He held on to the money for Jesus and his disciples, close friends of Jesus there. He was loved and respected by Jesus, which is pretty amazing that he was close friends. I mean, wouldn't it be neat to be able to say you were one of the close friends with Jesus? Well, of course it would, and Jesus was. In Luke 22, beginning at verse 3, it says, Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot. That shouldn't be misconstrued to mean that Judas had no ability to control himself. Satan entered into him, nothing he could do. He had to do it. That's not the case at all. Satan had influenced him. He had tempted him. But the reference here is there's something amiss in Judas's heart. He was tempted. He gave in to that temptation. For 30 pieces of silver was the price that he was paid for our Lord. A lot of people today are selling out for much cheaper than that. But he was paid 30 pieces of silver. They offered him, they agreed to give him the money, and then he consented on his own will, and he sought opportunity to betray Jesus, and that's exactly what he did. Being a close friend of his, seeing the things that Jesus did, knowing who he was, he still sought opportunity to betray him for a pretty cheap rate. Judas Iscariot. He was successful in a lot of ways, but he made a great mistake and was a failure toward God in that regard. All right, there's some Bible examples of successful people who made mistakes. And again, there's a whole lot more. Those are just 6 that I picked out. Let me go back. The point is, though, not every single time, as we said earlier, that a person chooses worldly things, that it's going to come back to get them. There's not some kind of karma out there. I hear people at work all the time talk about karma. That's karma coming to get them. And the idea is, if I do a lot of bad things, then bad things are going to start happening to me. And that's just not so. Bad things happen to good people all the time. Not a better example than that of Job. Job was a good man. Bad things happened to him. It wasn't some karma because he had done bad things. But there is a mighty and a just God that does settle accounts. And he does it in the life to come. And so we need to recognize that. We've got to recognize that and serve him and keep his commandments, because if our account with God has to be answered for, I need to make sure it's going to be one that I'm happy to answer to. Like these people, they were successful, but when their account needed to be answered to God, they had neglected spiritual things, and they were a failure toward God. So let's talk about true success for a minute. We can't just end without defining what really makes us successful as we bring the lesson to a close. And probably the best place I can think about to do that is think about the book of Ecclesiastes. And you'll remember that in the 12th chapter, Solomon's bringing a conclusion to everything that went on in the previous chapters. He tried a lot of things to determine the meaning of life. He tried work, and he found out that wasn't it. He considered all of his riches. He basically said the same thing that Jesus said: when you die, whose is it? It's going to belong to somebody else. So it's vanity to put all your trust in riches. You work so hard, you spend all of your life getting riches, and then the one that comes after you is going to get it, and they're going to waste it all away. That's what Solomon determined. He considered his power. He considered education. He considered pursuit of pleasure. And he said all of it's vanity. It don't mean anything when you get to the end. So what's the conclusion? The verses, I already previewed them and showed them to you accidentally. But he said in Ecclesiastes 12, beginning at verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. So what's the conclusion? What's it all about? Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. In the end, we're going to be judged by the things that we've done in the body. And so we need to be proving ourselves worthy. Not riches on this earth, but rather riches in heaven are what's going to count. And so as we're thinking about success, true success, again, in the end, it's going to be determined by what we've done in the body. And any other measure of success is irrelevant. On Judgment Day, God will not ask how much money you have in your bank account, because that's not going to matter to him, or how many possessions that you have. True success is having God number one in your life. And if God is not number one in your life, you cannot be successful. It shouldn't say a successful. It just should say you cannot be a success story if God is not number one in your life. And so we just say, as we bring the lesson to a close, if God is not first in your life today, and you can't be a success story, make him first. Make yourself successful to God, because nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. And so, do you need to become a Christian today? Do you need to get your priorities right? Maybe some of the things we talked about, and you thought, I'm a little off base there. I'm putting too much stock in wealth or anything else. If you need to get your priorities right with God, we'd say don't wait, don't delay on that. Make yourself right with God today. And if we can help, please let us know. If you need to become a Christian today, if you need to obey the gospel, we'd be glad to help you out in that regard. If you need the prayers of the church here, we'd be glad to pray for you and with you. Just let us know while we stand and sing the invitation song.